Okay, hey ladies and gentlemen, this is Miss Humbert here. Today we're going to be doing Unit 2, Learning Target 3 Notes. So we're actually going to be talking about graphing systems of inequalities. So before we've been graphing systems of equalities, we've been finding out where the line is. Well, now what we're actually going to be looking for is a shaded region that's overlapping. And for the purposes of this, you can write this in the first box and this in the second box, okay? So a system of linear inequalities is a set of two or more inequalities on the same graph, okay? The solution is the region where both of the inequalities are shaded. Okay, so our solution, as you can see on this one, is represented where the two are going to overlap. So that's what we're going to be looking for today. We're going to be looking for regions that overlap. So let's go ahead and let's just take a look at that first one. So we need to make a couple decisions about our inequalities before we even graph. So first thing I need to decide is if we're shading up or down. Well, I notice that there's no line underneath it, despite the fact that I just drew one. There's no line underneath this inequality. So first of all, I know that means that my line is going to be dotted. Then I notice that the alligator is facing away from the y, which means I'm going to be shading down. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's graph that. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 1. That's my y-intercept. Then my slope is negative 1x, which is the same as negative 1 over 1. So I'm going down 1, right 1. Down 1, right 1. And that's going to be a dotted line. Okay, so then I said that I need to shade down from the line. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this lightly. Now, a lot of students find this a lot easier if they do that in different colors, okay? So first of all, for this one, there's a line beneath the inequality. So then we're going to have a solid line, okay? Then it's facing away from the y, so I'm going to be shading down. So now I'm going to go ahead and graph that line. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 3, and then my slope is 2, which is the same as 2 over 1. So I'm going up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1. Now that's going to be a solid line between that. And then I said that I was going to be shading down. So I see where my 2 overlap, so I want to make sure that I shade that in really, really obvious to make it obvious to me when I look at it where your answer lies. So that's your answer for number 1. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at number 2. So I notice that it's opening up, and it's because the alligator's eating the y, so I know I'm going to be shading up. Okay, so then the line, there's no line underneath that inequality, so I know my line is going to be dotted. Now for me, it's easiest to do one line at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and graph this first one. So I'm crossing the y-axis at 1, and then I'm going up 1 over 1, dot, up 1 over 1, dot, and that one right there is going to be a dotted line, and then we're shading up. So we're going to go this way. Okay, so now let's take a look at this next one. So I'm going to change the colors. So first of all, it's facing away from the y, so we're going to shade down. If it'll let me write a D, there we go. And then it's no line underneath, so that means my line is going to be dotted. So we're crossing the y-axis at negative 3, and then my slope is 1, which is the same as up 1 over 1. So I'm going to do that, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. So then let's go ahead and let's make this a dotted line. Okay, so then now I need to shade down. So I notice here that I'm not crossing at any point. So then this is the kind of inequalities version of no solution because there's no point where those two cross over each other. Okay, so let's take a look at number 3. So for number 3, what we're going to do is we're going to do some more decision making, okay? So I noticed for the first one that the alligator's opening towards the y, so I need to shade up. Okay, then I notice that there's a line underneath it, so then I know my line needs to be solid. So I'm crossing the y-axis at a negative 6, and then my slope is 3, which is the same as 3 over 1. So I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, and over 1. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect the dotted lines. And then I want to shade up. So I'm just going to go ahead and lightly shade that in pink. I'm not making it too solid right now because I want to make sure it's obvious where my crossover is. Okay, so for the shading, here it's facing away from the y, so I'm going to be shading down. And then I notice that there's a solid line underneath the inequality, which means it's going to be solid. So we're crossing the y-axis at 4. So then I'm going to go down 2 and right 1 because my slope is -2, which is the same as -2/1. So down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. And then we're going to have a solid line. Then from that one, I'm shading underneath. So again, I want to make it obvious where those are crossing over. So I'm going to shade this part in really, really darkly so that I remember, okay, that's the part that represents both of the answers. Now, taking a look at number 4. So let's figure out our shading. Well, the alligator's facing away from the Y, so we're going to be shading down. And it's always good to make these decisions in advance. And then there's a solid line underneath the inequality, so that means that our line is going to be solid. So we're crossing the y-axis at 3, and then my slope is 1, which is the same as 1 over 1. So I'm going up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. So then we're going to go ahead and shade that in. So then we're going down from that line, okay? So then taking a look at this next one. So for this next one, what we're going to do is we're going to look at our shading. Well, it's opening towards the Y, so I'm shading up. And then there's no line underneath that inequality, so then my line is going to be dotted. So we're crossing the y-axis at 2. And then my slope is -1, which is the same as -1 over 1. So I'm going down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. So that's going to be a dotted line going this way. And then I need to shade up. So now I want to take a look where my 2 overlapped, and I want to shade that in really dark. So this is where they overlapped right there. So that's my final answer for number 4. So if you think you understand these and you want to try the rest of these by yourself, you can do that as well. So I noticed here that it's opening towards my Y, so it's going to be shaded up. There's no line underneath my inequality, so it's going to be dotted. Okay, so then we're crossing the y-axis at a -2. And then my slope is 3 over 1. So I'm going up 1, 2, 3, and over 1. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have a dotted line. Okay, so then I know I'm shading up from that line. So I'm just going to shade that in lightly. Now let's take a look at that next one. So I notice that it's opening towards the Y, so again I'm shading up. There's no line underneath, so that one is also going to be dotted. So now what I want to do is I want to cross the y-axis at 4 because that's my y-intercept right there. So then my slope is -1, which is the same as -1 over 1. So I'm going down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a dotted line, and I need to shade up. So I only have a little small portion of overlap right here, and that's going to be right in this region right here is going to be my overlap. Again, you always want to make that really obvious, especially when you're taking a quiz. I always need to know your thinking. Okay, so let's take a look at number 6. So for this first one, I see that the alligator's facing away from the Y, so that means I'm shading down. Okay, then I'm noticing that there's no line underneath the inequality, so that means I'm going to have a dotted line. So let's go ahead and let's draw that. So we're crossing the y-axis at 2, and then my slope is 2, which is the same as 2 over 1. So I'm going up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1. So then I'm going to have this be dashed. Okay, so then I'm going to shade beneath the inequality, like so. So then let's take a look at this next one. So then our shading, it's opening towards the Y, so we're going to shade up. And then there's a solid number underneath, or there's a solid line underneath the inequality, so it's going to be a solid line. So we're crossing the y-axis at a -3. If at any point you're confused about how to do the shading, you still don't remember from Unit 1, please come talk to me and let me know. I'm more than happy to help you. And then, since it's a -1, we're going down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. And so that's going to be a solid line. And from that one, we're going to go ahead and shade up. So now I want to color in really darkly where the 2 overlap, which is going to be right here. So I'm trying to make that really obvious to whoever looks at my answer. Now, let's take a look at these last two. These last two can be a little confusing because of the fact that they are just going to simply be horizontal and vertical lines. So whenever you just have an X, that means you're going to have a vertical line, if it'll let me write out vertical. No? That's cool. Okay, so since we have it opening towards the X, we're going to be shading up. Okay, now up isn't going to really make sense with a vertical line, so we'll talk about that here in a second. So then, since there's no line underneath it, it's going to be dotted. So to draw that vertical line when it's just an X, you're going to find 3 on the X axis, and you're going to have a a vertical dashed line. So now I notice that it's opening towards the X, which means we want larger than 3. So I'm going to look at X as a number line. Okay, as I go this way, X is getting smaller. As I go this way, X is getting bigger, which is the side we want because we want things greater than 3. So I'm going to go ahead and shade that in. Now, when we have things that are just a Y, that means it's going to be horizontal. I'm just going to abbreviate that, okay? So then our shading, it's facing away from the Y, so we're going to shade down. And then there's no line underneath the inequality, so it's going to be dotted. Okay, so when I'm going to draw that horizontal line when it's just a Y, I'm going to find my Y, my -2, on that Y axis. And I'm going to have a horizontal dotted line going through that Y. So then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shade down from that area. So the last thing I need to do is make it really obvious where my shading overlaps, and that's going to be right there in that bottom corner. So let's take a look at this last problem here. So again, we're going to have our X's and just our Y's. So since we're looking at less than 4, here's 4 on the X-axis. So when we're looking for numbers less than 4, we want to go left. So where we used to just talk about up and down, when we're dealing with vertical lines, we want to look at less than as left. Okay? And since there's no line underneath it, this one is going to be dotted. Okay? So we're crossing the Y-axis at 4, and so that's going to be a dotted line. Okay, so then it's going to be less than 4, which means I'm going to have it going that way. So now let's go ahead and let's graph the Y is less than 6. So we're going to be shading down since it's facing away from the Y. And then since there's a line underneath there, my line is going to be solid. Okay, so I'm going to find 6 on the Y-axis, which is right here. And then I'm going to draw a horizontal solid line through it. And then I'm going to shade down. So I actually have a really large region where they overlap, and that region is right here. So I want to make it really, really obvious where my final shaded region is, okay? So that concludes your note video for today. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.